Good evening, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to the Shelter Rock Forum here at the Unitarian Universalist congregation at Shelter Rock. I'm the Reverend Ned White, the interim senior minister here at the congregation, serving with Jennifer Brower and Natalie Fenimore, and I am honored to be able to welcome you here. Unitarian Universalism values the democratic process, and we particularly value the kind of a knowledge base in the electorate that makes for a healthy democracy. So that's why we have programs like the Shelter Rock Forum, and we're really delighted that you, who are committed, knowledgeable citizens, a little bit like preaching to the choir, I'm afraid, but I'm glad that the choir is here to sing praises of the kind of democracy that we value and prize. And I think the program tonight will be helpful to all of us in expanding our own understanding and horizons. It is my pleasure to introduce Colin Woodhouse, who is the chair of the Shelter Rock Forum, who will continue with our introductions, and we're very, very glad to have you all here.
Thank you, Reverend Ned White. I too would like to welcome you all here, especially folks from outside our community. A special welcome to you. It's so great to have you here. This is a very important topic for all of us to consider. I am a volunteer chairperson of the Shelter Rock Forum. The forum has been in existence well over 40 years. We've had very, very notable people come and talk about what was going on at a certain time of history, at a certain time in our culture, and we're continuing this process right now as we continue to move into the next few years as Shelter Rock Forum. The purpose of the Shelter Rock Forum is to provide a platform for well-informed and reasoned opinions on issues of importance to us as individuals, as family members, as communities, as citizens of the United States, and as human beings who share the earth at this time and place in history. It is our goal to sponsor programs that are relevant to the human experience, that challenge us to reevaluate established cultural norms, and to question the source of assumptions that frame our individual worldviews. It is a hope of the Shelter Rock Forum that scholars such as Dr. Stanley will guide us to a better understanding of the social and cultural forces affecting us as we continue to evolve as human beings. Before we formally introduce Dr. Jason Stanley, I'd like to thank members of the Shelter Rock Forum and our staff for their terrific support. This is a team effort that without all of us working together, we would not be able to host such events. I'd like to recognize volunteer members, Elaine and Jim Peters. Hopefully, we all have name tags on. In the back there, thank you. They're our greeters. Latifah Woodhouse, Jim Ansel. Jim, where are you? There's Jim back there. Bob Nuxall, the money taker from the back. He's still out there gathering resources. Richard Tibbetts. Rich, there's Richard. And Ellen Council, also out in the back table. And I also want to recognize our guest today, Dr. Michael D'Incenzo. He is Professor Emeritus at Hofstra University, and he is a gentleman. Thank you, Michael. I have gone to many of his presentations, and he's been a frequent guest here, and it's always very informative. Thank you, Professor, for showing up tonight. We'll look forward to your questions and debate, possibly. And also, we've benefited from a terrific staff. We have Claire DeRoche Claire DeRoche is our social justice coordinator. Claire. We have Jen Sapel, who is our communications director, and Sharon Esposito, who is our staff person for the Shelter Rock Forum. And certainly we benefited from the spiritual guidance of Reverend Ned White and his team ministry. Thank you, Ned. So, here's our schedule tonight. We will invite Dr. Stanley to make his presentation, and we'll follow with question and answer. I invite you to write your questions down on that little piece of paper that we handed out. If you prefer, we'll have a microphone and you can ask your question directly. It's now my pleasure to invite our Social Justice Coordinator, Claire DeRoche, to formally introduce Dr. Jason Stanley.
Thank you, Colin. Good evening, everyone. It's a pleasure to see all of you here tonight. And it's my pleasure to introduce Professor Jason Stanley to you. I first encountered Jason several months ago when he was interviewed by Amy Goodman on her program, Democracy Now! He impressed me as a first-rate academic who could explain serious topics in language that a non-academic like me could understand. Therefore, when I brought Jason to the attention of the Shelter Rock Forum Committee, I was delighted when they said, "Invite him." I won't repeat Jason's considerable credentials and publications, some of which are listed in the program. However, I would like to share with you an insight that I gained while preparing for tonight's program. I did some research on Jason's biography, and through doing that, I gained a little more understanding of the kind of person that Jason is. Because our Social Justice Committee has a focus on criminal justice reform, especially advocacy for the Halt Solitary Confinement Act, I was impressed to learn that Jason is a board member of the Prison Policy Initiative. He chose to become a board member and to become involved with PPI because, and I quote, "As academics can appreciate, they, PPI, are drawn to the complexities of mass incarceration rather than the obvious stuff that draws funding." I am impressed that Jason has chosen to give his time to working with an important group on a critical issue that others might not immediately connect with his work as a philosopher and a college professor. I'm grateful that Jason accepted our invitation, and now it is my pleasure to invite Jason to the podium.
Thank you, Paula. So, my father and mother came to the United States as refugees from anti-Semitism. My father came to New York on a boat in July 1939, right soon before he turned 7. And we have a picture book of my father that my grandmother had from her childhood until that point. And the last page of that picture book is 6 different pictures of the Statue of Liberty coming into view. My mother survived the war in a Siberian labor camp and was repatriated back to Warsaw. When anti-Semites in the streets of Warsaw beat my grandfather almost to death, they came to New York City when she was 8, from Warsaw. And they raised me with 2 very different views, but intersected on one lesson, that democracy is fragile, that humanity's respect for humanity is even more fragile, and that they had different reactions to this basic fact. My mother, who worked in the criminal justice system as a court stenographer, 33 years in Manhattan District Court, including the Central Park 5 case, her view was, they're going to kill someone, just be glad it isn't you. My father's view, my father was a sociology professor who was deeply devoted to working on the roots of humans' inhumanity to humans. And although, as he writes in his one book, The Technological Conscience, Survival and Dignity in an Age of Expertise, although he says pessimism is the humanist's viewpoint, and no other view will be considered here. He nevertheless held out hope and reminded me continually of not only my family's legacy of struggle against oppression, but also the fact that in the United States we have the legacy of struggle of African Americans who have struggled against fascism, who have written for decades and decades, for 150 years. They've faced knowingly an ideology that told them they were less than human, that dehumanized them, that represented them falsely as rapists, as murderers, and continually fought back and never gave up hope. And I think you can see why I work on the topic of mass incarceration today. For many years, I was working in, as my father would describe it, on the semicolon, on topics that were not of central interest. I mean, they are of central interest. Try writing something without using a semicolon. But I did not delve into topics like propaganda and ideology until about 7 years ago, when I started writing for the New York Times. My first piece for the New York Times, The Ways of Silencing, was about birtherism. So I noticed that a man named Donald Trump was going on television and saying this crazed conspiracy theory. And I knew from my upbringing that it's a very dangerous sign when conspiracy theories get floated. And I knew from the kind of reading that my father did with me, Hannah Arendt, Origins of Totalitarianism. This was light reading in our household. The bathroom book in our house, I don't know if you guys had a bathroom book, but we had a bathroom book, was Robert J. Lifton's The Nazi Doctors, which as a result I had memorized by the age of 15. But my father was very keen on the message that education is not as much of a protection as we might like. But Arendt talks about conspiracy theories, and she talks about the protocol. If you understand the history of the protocols of the Elders of Zion, which is very important, you can see the structure of how conspiracy theories work in a body politic. What the National Socialists did is they said, the Jews control the press. The Jews control everything. And you can tell the Jews control the press because the press never reports on the fact that the Jews control the press. And so this is a trap. This is a trap. Because if the press says, oh, okay, we better report that politicians say Jews control us, well, it legitimates the conspiracy theory. Because suddenly, it's in the Berliner Tageblatt, or the New York Times. But if they don't report on it, they're also feeding into the conspiracy. And we saw this with birtherism. In May 2012, Donald Trump on Fox News said, CNN is controlled by Obama. And you could tell because they never report that CNN is controlled by Obama. So this structure is repeated again and again. The media becomes complicit when they report it, but it's not really clear what the media should do. It's not an easy situation, and when the epistemic space, the public epistemic space, the information space, gets occluded with very extreme conspiracy theories, it's not really clear what to do. It's not really clear whether not reporting it is the thing to do or reporting it. Both have bad consequences. I think probably reporting it has worse consequences. One thing that those who study the propaganda, Russia's disinformation campaigns and Vladislav Surkov's tactics, Putin's propaganda minister, for lack of a better word, political technologist is the term they use, is that the goal is not to establish a counter-narrative. The goal is to destroy narratives altogether. The goal is to make it such that no one knows what to believe, no one knows what's true, no one knows at all what reality, who's speaking the truth, who to turn to, and so they just turn back to enjoying the spectacle, and it all becomes just television. So I'm going to enter, as you can see, this topic partly by my personal narrative, because I first started, so 2011 was my first piece in the public sphere, Ways of Silencing on Birtherism. But I began to be interested in the topic of mass incarceration, because when if you look at mass incarceration, right now, if you look at the world's prison population, 9% of the world's prison population is Black American. There are, I think, 38 million Black Americans. So 7 billion people, 9%, almost 10% of everyone in prison in the world comes from a tiny, microscopic population, half the size of, less than Italy, less than half the size of Germany. And I think the only other time that that was true was, I would guess, the Holocaust. So when you look at the conditions in our country before politicians, before various symptoms, what I regard as symptoms, I regard the politics that Trump employs as a symptom of what has long been happening in our country. First, the treatment of Black Americans. Secondly, the treatment of Muslims after 9/11. This enables a fascist politics. When you have, so in the 1990s, starting in 1990 and 1991, you had a powerful decrease in violent crime. Violent crime started precipitously dropping. Does anyone know under what mayor, New York City mayor, violent crime started precipitously dropping? David Dinkins. So under David Dinkins, violent crime in New York City started precipitously dropping. But nevertheless, if you look at the 1990s is filled with horrifically racist vilification of young Black men. Violent crime starts dropping well before this. So if you look at maybe the peak of the rhetoric, it peaks probably with super predator theory in 1995 and 1996. Violent crime had been dropping for 5 years, precipitously. Super predator theory, John DiIulio and Vincent Fox, John DiIulio was a Princeton professor, William Bennett and John DiIulio published a book in 1996 called Body Count. And it predicted that by 2010, the streets of American cities would be running red with blood. I don't know if you realize, but we are in a historically, by 2013, 2014, we had the lowest levels of violent crime ever recorded since they started taking statistics in the United States. And what they said, and if you look closely at DiIulio's writings and Bennett's writings, they say violent crime has been dropping for years, but don't uncork the champagne. But somehow people overlooked that. DiIulio predicted a 5-fold increase in violent crime from 1995 to 2000. He predicted this in 1995. He got tenure at Princeton on this basis. By 2000, violent crime had halved and then halved again. But in the interim, over 40 states had passed laws charging juveniles as adults. Because what super predator theory did, and attendant hysteria, is it convinced people that, in DiIulio's words, there was a coming wave of super predators who could kill, maim, who killed, maimed, and raped without remorse. He never explained why, if they didn't have any feelings, they would enjoy killing and raping and maiming in the first place. But why did this, and if you look at the statistical basis that DiIulio used, his argument was basically this. His argument was, look at the violent crime rate in 1990 and 1991 among young black men. And you'll notice that, I think, 6%, I think it was 6%, or might have been more, might have been 1 out of every 6. He looked at the percentage of young black men, teenagers, who were committing violent crimes in 1991. And then he made an overly generous prediction of the birth rates among black Americans. And then simply assumed that there was a fixed permanent rate of violent crime in populations. Now, what is that assumption? That assumption is that some groups are genetically fixed to a rate of violent crime independent of environmental circumstances. And, that would be racism. So none of this came to pass. Even by the time they formulated this theory, it was known that violent crime had been precipitously dropping. But instead, what you had was a severe increase in sentencing. You had local prosecutors moving from charging 1 out of every 3 crimes as felonies to 2 out of every 3. You just had an incredible increase in penalties. And if you compare the United States with Canada, Canada had a very similar crime dip. So violent crime rising through the 80s and then dropping precipitously through the 90s, but Canada didn't have mass incarceration. So it's very difficult to look at the policies of mass incarceration, which in any case came in their most draconian forms well after the dip in violent crime started, and to see them as causally implicated in further drops in violent crime. So what was happening there? Well, we had labeled a generations of young black men as thugs, as super predators. We had labeled them with terms that placed them outside of the circle of humanity. After 9/11, you saw this again. You saw the treatment of. And it's not like public culture. It's not like this was somehow a mystery. If you listen to the music in the 1990s, if you listen to Tupac Shakur, for instance, NWA, if you listen to rap music, you would hear clearly Tupac telling you, his friends are in prison for 50 years to life, telling you these extreme, and when Tupac calls himself a thug, there's an interview with which I begin my 2015 book, How Propaganda Works, with Tupac, when the reporter asks him, what do you say about the charge that you're glorifying violence? And Tupac looks at her and says, when I sing, I live the thug life, baby, it's hopeless. Maybe that sounds like glorifying to some kid in the suburbs. But believe me, if he picks up the thug life, he's going to give it up really quickly. But the person who is living the thug life knows that I know it's hopeless and will listen to me again. So if you listen to rap music in the 1990s, you find very clear stories about what's going on. But what happened with that music? It was labeled as violent, it was labeled a gangster rap, even though what it was trying to do was trying to send a message to fellow members of the African American community saying, they're calling us thugs, they're calling us criminals, but we're not, we're human, here are our stories. So this process of taking groups of people and turning them into criminals is something that black Americans have faced, since there were black Americans in the United States. Khalil Muhammad, in his book, 2010 book, The Condemnation of Blackness, the Kennedy School Harvard professor, chapter 2 is called Writing Race into Crime. And what we now have is writing immigration into crime. This is a tactic in the kind of politics we see. It's a way of taking a fellow group of humans and saying they're beyond the pale. When you call someone a super predator, what do you do with super predators? You kill them, right? Who wants super predators? In the Rwandan genocide, they called Tutsi snakes and cockroaches for years until it burst into violence. Right now, the President of the United States is regularly reads a poem called The Snake to rallies, where it's about a snake who's taken in by an old lady, an old woman, who then nurses the snake back to health, and the snake, it's a venomous snake, and when the snake is back to health, the snake bites her, and she dies. And she says, "Why did you do that?" And the snake says, "I'm a snake, you silly woman." So we know that it's dangerous. We know from multiple sources in our own country's history, which legitimated treatment of black Americans in a certain way, which if you read any description of what happened in Guantanamo Bay, which is, by the way, called Camp Justice. You will see, I mean, it's horrific. I mean, I was reading the other day a description of a man who is completely innocent, who for years, he was talking about the masks. You've seen those masks they put on people, right? So he talked about how it just lets your brain think that you're going to suffocate at all times, and they kept them on. And he said the worst time is when they take them off, because then the oxygen flows in, and then when they put it back on again, you feel like you're going to die. So this is what we've been doing, and there's a certain way of legitimating the treatment of fellow humans like this. And a lot of my work involves what that way is. That's by way of preamble. We have a long history here of, for lack of a better word, dehumanizing large groups of people. But we also have a glorious history of fighting back against it and making progress against it. So, the civil rights movement, it's always one step forward, a half step back. Mass incarceration follows the civil rights movement, of course. But the civil rights movement did happen, and it was us that did it, we Americans. So we have that hope. But somehow, what happens is that politicians regularly discover that there are certain tactics that create an us versus them dynamic based on race, based on religion, based on nationality, that propels them into power. And these are a set of tactics I call fascist tactics. I mean, there's more to fascism that I will explain, but this is core to fascist tactics. To remove empathy from a group of people on the basis of race, lack of shared race, religion, language, national background. If you want to protect yourself against these tactics, I think it's important just to refuse to treat people that way. Like to have a history, to be guarded against calling anyone, against dehumanizing groups of people. I have a 2018 piece in the New York Times called "Who is a Criminal?" My grandmother, Ilsa Stanley, wrote one of the first Holocaust memoirs in the English language called "The Unforgotten." And I've been using it because it's very revealing, because it's about the 1930s in Berlin. People don't realize it took years and years and years and years for things to get really bad in Germany. And she talks about, and she was going into concentration camps, into Sachsenhausen, the model concentration camp. She rescued 412 people dressed as a Nazi social worker. Long story. So she knew what was happening, but her fellow Jews didn't know what was happening. And she had a very hard time convincing them, because the Nazi propaganda at the time said they were only targeting criminal Jews. So I have this piece in the New York Times called "Who is a Criminal?" And that was stunning to me, because of course, at first, in our current situation, they said, we're only targeting criminal immigrants. At first, we're only targeting MS-13. And then it became, well, anyone who's crossed the border illegally is a criminal, right? That moved quickly. And that's what happened in Germany. They started first with, we're only going to arrest the criminal Jews. And then it moved quickly. And what Khalil Muhammad shows in Condemnation of Blackness is when you link a group with criminality. So Sarah Saunders said, Sarah Huckabee Saunders said, what she does whenever she's confronted with the fact that we're vilifying immigrants, she's like, oh, are you defending MS-13? But the goal is, the way propaganda works is you continually link the term with some really hated thing. So you continually say, black rapist. You continually say, Jewish rapist. You continually say, immigrant rapist. And then, then when challenged, you say, I'm just talking about the immigrant rapists. But then when people hear the term immigrant, they connect it. If you look at the texts of the European far right, like Guillaume Fay's 2001 book, Why We Fight, or Daniel Fleaberg's 2015 book, The Real Right Returns. These are toxic texts, by the way. What people don't realize, because they haven't read the texts that are being cited by people like Steve Bannon, is that these are toxic texts. Steve Bannon tells us to read The Camp of the Saints. It's a 1973 French book that's very central to the European far right, about 1 million Indian refugees sailing in ships to Europe, and finally they land in France. And it ends with all white women in Europe being consigned to bordellos. This is a book Steve Bannon recommends we read. So when I'm talking about the European far right, I'm talking about the European far right. And, so Guillaume Fay and in Why We Fight, the center of Why We Fight is what he calls a meta-political dictionary. And it's a bunch of words that he says are important to mainstream. And when you look at because they condition people in the right way. I think the first entry is alien. He says, non-Europeans are aliens. Have you noticed that alien is the official term for immigrant now used? Sonia Sotomayor, in a famous decision, said we should no longer use the term alien. But if you look at the European far right, they say, you should always, in your speeches, use the term alien. So if you're curious about the ideology that people have, look at the language they're using. Because, because the ideology is born by the language. And what concerns me is all across the world, as far-right movements move to power in Brazil, in India, in Israel, in Andalusia, in Spain, in Italy, we're seeing a uniform terminology. We're seeing a uniform terminology that's reflective of a certain kind of ideology. Now, what is that ideology? Maybe it helps to begin with liberal democracy. What is liberal democracy? Liberal democracy is two values: liberty and equality. Liberty and equality both depend on truth. Equality depends on truth because equality is speaking truth to power. Equality in liberal democracy doesn't mean material equality. Liberal democracy allows one person to be rich and another person to be poor, although it's an interesting question how great that divide can be and still be a liberal democracy. But liberal democracy involves our economic status to be a function of our life choices. But liberal democracy demands that the poorest among us can still speak truth to power. So equality in liberal democracy is based on truth. Liberty, too, is based on truth. This is might be a little trickier to see. Think about North Korea. Or think about Russia. People in those countries, if you had a democratic election, if you had an election, they would vote for their leader every time. Putin has like an 86% approval rating. I'm sure North Korean leaders approval ratings are well over 95%, even in the worst of times. That's because they've been lied to, right? If you've been lied to, your vote doesn't matter. If you don't know what the world is like, if you've been completely lied to, you're going to vote on the basis of lies. And so you're not really free. If you've been lied to, you're not free. If you live in a world, in a video game and don't realize you live in a video game, you're not free. Freedom requires truth. Freedom requires knowing, a free vote requires knowing who you're voting for, that is knowing facts about them, and knowing why you're voting for them. So simply voting is not a democracy. A democracy requires a free press, full access to information, and it requires that you vote on the basis of some knowledge that an education system is supposed to give you. So if you want to destroy democracy, you want to destroy truth. If you want to destroy democracy, liberty, and equality, you want to destroy the education system. You want to make the public education system terrible. That should be your first goal. You want to destroy the information space. You want to replace legitimate, you want to replace a common basis with reality with different information streams, most of which are just spectacle and amusement. Because then you destroy truth. Then all that remains is spectacle. And when all that remains is spectacle, people are going to choose the most entertaining one. And when you read Arendt and when you read Adorno, that's what they tell us. So liberal democracy is based on truth. And that's why when politicians consistently lie, what they're doing is they're attacking the basis of liberal democracy. So the idea that there's a system based simply on power is as old as political philosophy as itself. Plato's Republic begins with Thrasymachus. And Thrasymachus says in Book 1, Thrasymachus says to Plato, all that matters is power. What's good, virtue is weakness. The most powerful person sets the rules. And all of Plato's Republic is devoted to arguing against Thrasymachus. Now, Plato famously hates democracy, but he loves truth. He thinks the reply to Thrasymachus should be that the philosophers, I mean, we like Plato for this reason, and we kind of like Plato. He says, we're in charge, but we don't get to own anything, and we live in misery. So philosophers are the rulers for Plato. We set the rules and tell everyone what to do because we're the lovers of truth, but we're not allowed to own any private property because otherwise we would rule in our own self-interest. A long-standing feature of political philosophy is the recognition that greed and ruling are incompatible. So Thrasymachus sets power up, and Plato wants to counter him by saying, no, truth has sway over power. And this is partly the way to fascism. Fascism is an ideology based on power. Fascism says the winners have value and the losers have none. And this is what Thrasymachus says. The winners have value and the losers have none. And Plato says, no, everyone has value, different value, but Plato places no value on democracy because he says democracy is not a system that is tenable because people want a strong leader. It's too hard. He says democracy leads directly to tyranny. And the route that Plato describes is Plato says, Plato argues in Book 8, democracy values freedom of speech. But freedom of speech will allow a tyrant to divide the population, stir fear, set one part of the population against another, and present him. The tyrant will use freedom of speech to set one part of the population against another, setting himself up as the protector of the people. And then once the people have been drawn into such terrified fear of each other, I say this as our president gives a speech about a wall, trying to turn a calm public into a frightened one. Once the tyrant spreads fear using freedom of speech, he will come into power and then end democracy. That's Book 8 of the Republic. That's why Plato says that democracy leads straight to tyranny. But that's not my view. But Plato sets up truth as against power. But we don't have fascism yet, because fascism isn't just about power. For fascism, you need another element, an element that doesn't come until the 19th century. You need nationalism. Nationalism, so Steve Miller, the president's aide, recently said, liberalism is new, nationalism is much older and much more natural. This is not true. Nationalism is very recent. If you look at the discussions, if you look at Spinoza's formulation of the problem of ideology, Spinoza says, and I want you to listen carefully now, why do so many die so that one man may boast? Spinoza isn't talking about nationalism there. He's talking about monarchy. He's talking about dynasties. What you had before the 19th century were largely dynasties. You had kings and queens, and you had people dying for their kings or their religion, or the Pope, or the Caliph. They died for leaders. Nationalism, there are various philosophers, you can blame it on. Hegel is sometimes mentioned, certainly Fichte in the Addresses on the German Nation. But nationalism comes from the idea, especially hyper-nationalism, comes from the idea, well, nationalism comes from the idea that, you know, life involves struggle, and these struggles are too difficult to manage alone, so we must manage them as a group. And so Thrasymachus is saying individual power is all that matters. There are winners and losers. The losers just have to do what the winner says. The nationalist says, I mean, there are different varieties of nationalism, some harmful, others not harmful, I argue in my book. But all of them are based on myth. The idea that there's a nation with a uniform ethnic and linguistic past. Benedict Anderson's famous book is called Imagined Communities. And you create this myth of a uniform nation that existed for a long time. And in the sort of basic, in extreme versions of nationalism, what you say is that we need this nation because we need to face other nations in a struggle. And in this struggle, one nation will come out supreme, and that nation will rule. And that version of struggle and power, where it's not located in the individual, but it's located in a skin color, in a fictitious national identity, that's the extra element you need for modern day fascism. Modern day fascism is social Darwinism, modern day, meaning 20th century and 21st century fascism. Social Darwinism of the group. Our group is better because they've dominated civilization. Our group is better because they had great military conquests. Life is a struggle between groups. The groups that are irrelevant should just die or whatever. They're irrelevant. They're not our concern. Our group is our concern. And life should be set up as a struggle of group against group. And then you give, and in fascist politics, you take your group and you say, you know, you create you say, we were once great. Look at what we did. But we've lost. We've been humiliated. We've been humiliated by equality. Equality has made us weak. We must go back to when we were glorious. So what you find in fascist politics is especially powerful in times of decline of empire. So, of course, Hitler was writing about Versailles, and the Humiliés du Bois in The World in Africa notes Hitler is particularly exercised about Germany's loss of their colonies in Africa. So in Hungary, Viktor Orbán came to power. Like, I was in Hungary in 2009, 2010, and I was hearing everywhere about Trianon, the treaty in World War I that broke up the Austro-Hungarian Empire. And Viktor Orbán came to power saying, look, we were once the great European empire, and look at what happened. Greater Hungary was lost. So this idea of, in Israel, you find discussions of, Judea and some of the greater Israel, and here in the United States, we find discussion of, loss of empire. I did a linguistic analysis of Trump's speeches from 2015 to 2017 that I published in the Washington Post in a piece called Donald Trump Almost Never Uses Democratic Vocabulary. And if you rank all the words, my co-author and I ranked all the words in every speech he gave from 2015 to 2017. China was one of his top 20. Mexico was one of his top 30 or 40. He's the only presidential candidate who almost never uses the term freedom or liberty. The only time he ever uses justice, this probably changed in 2017, but the only time between 2015 and 2017 that he ever used justice was not in a liberal democratic way, but bring him to justice, like that. So this harping on threats to empire is very powerful. So in fascist politics, the idea is that there's a nation. It was once great, and it's been brought low by liberalism, by immigration, by mixing, by feminism. Fascist politics is harshly patriarchal. Jair Bolsonaro, Brazil's new president, when he was running, said, I had four boys, and then I grew weak, and I had a daughter. Fascist politics harkens back to a mythic past, where just many kinds of politics harken back to a mythic past, but fascist politics harkens back to a mythic past where the country was great, where men did hard labor and military and great military exploits, and women stayed at home and took care of raised children. In Viktor Orbán, in Hungary's fundamental law of 2011, passed the new Hungarian constitution, passed by Viktor Orbán, he says the constitution will help make Hungary great again, and he says the foundation of Hungary is the traditional family. And this is not to say that everyone who says the traditional family is important is a fascist. That's not true. We need social conservatives in the fight against fascism. Fascism is based on social Darwinism. Fascism is based on the idea that we need a certain structure of society in order to fight other nations and win and maintain dominance. And that's not Christianity. Christianity is not we need to fight other people and kill them and rule, and we owe to Christianity the concept of human rights. So the basis of fascism is this social Darwinism of national identity. In fascist politics, you get the dominant group to feel that like they're victims of minority groups. So Hitler is constantly going on about how Jews are bringing in. Hitler actually says Hitler blames Germany's lax immigration laws on Jews. So Hitler goes on and on about Germany's lax immigration laws, which are the laughingstock of the world. So the idea is that bringing in foreigners is going to weaken the nation. And there's a zero-sum way of thinking, that there's a certain amount of respect that people get, and if you have equality, then the dominant nation will not get the sort of the dominant group will not get the respect they deserve as the creators of civilization, as Hitler says in Mein Kampf. There are three groups: civilization creators, civilization maintainers, and civilization destroyers. And only the Aryans are the first group. So when you find people talking about how, like, their group is responsible for all of civilization, their group is responsible for all the goods of society, their group created civilization, their group was a great empire, that's classic fascist politics. So I'm going to, because I want to shift to questions, I'm going to cut short soon and just give you a quick rundown of the 10 chapters of my book that are the sort of 10 properties of fascist politics. And I think this is a politics that you see many politicians all over the world employing. And the thing about fascist politics, people often ask me, do these leaders believe this? And my response is, it doesn't matter, because fascist politics is about power. And since it's about power, it's not about truth. And since it's not about truth, it doesn't matter if you believe it. It's just a method to win an election and to maintain power. And so it just doesn't matter. It doesn't matter if someone is a committed anti-Semite or a committed racist, or is just a tactical anti-Semite or a tactical racist, or a tactical misogynist. What matters is whether those tactics help them come to power. So the first chapter of my book is called The Mythic Past, and there I fill in this idea of the fascist mythic past. Chapter 2 is called Propaganda. It's about the very particular structure of fascist propaganda that those of you familiar with 1984 will recognize. Guantanamo Bay is called Camp Justice. Things are called their opposite. War is peace, right, from 1984. One example I use, in fascist politics, always is an anti-corruption campaign. Putin in 2011 ran an anti-corruption campaign. And since I'm on camera, I will say I think Putin is a great leader. But, that was a joke. But he is a scary leader. So he ran an anti-corruption campaign in 2011. Putin is, by many estimates, the wealthiest person alive. Now he has no money in his bank, but his daughter has $3 billion in cash. So, I mean, he's titanically wealthy. No one knows exactly how much money, but he ran an anti-corruption campaign. The Law and Justice Party in Poland that has destroyed the court system is called the Law and Justice Party. Orban constantly runs anti-corruption campaigns. In our own country, President Trump ran an anti-corruption campaign. Remember? What? Drain the swamp. Right, drain the swamp, which of course Mussolini was also a slogan of Mussolini's. What corruption means there is the wrong person is in charge. So that's what it means. So the next chapter after propaganda is called Unreality. That's breaking down truth because you want to replace truth by power for the reasons adumbrated. The next chapter is called Hierarchy. You want to create you want to say there's a hierarchy of groups. Some groups have more value. Some groups have proven that they have more value. Over generations, they've shown that they are better groups, that they've created more civilization, that they've created more works of art, literature, that they've dominated in war. And hierarchy is, of course, since of course we all pretty much stink to roughly equal degrees, hierarchy is a myth. So it adds on to the mythic nature, to the attack on truth. Chapter 5 is called Victimhood. Once you've set up your hierarchy and you've shown that your group are the greatest, most hardworking people in human history, you say, look, we're victims because this isn't recognized. We're being asked to share power with those who are not worth as much as we are. We're asked to share power with, dirty, scraggly people who just have no worth, because they're losers. It is always the case that the in-group, that the in-group are hardworking and law-abiding, and the out-group are lazy and criminal. Everywhere you go. So that's victimhood. The dominant group is made to feel like the victims of equality. I end the chapter with a Viktor Orban speech on October 12, 2017, the keynote speech to the International Conference on the Persecution of Christians, when he declared Christians to be the most discriminated against group in the world. That's a standard tactic. So the next chapter is law and order. All fascist politicians run law and order campaigns. Because the nation, the chosen group, the in-group, are by nature not criminal. Criminal means the other people. So I begin the chapter with Jeff Sessions in November 2016 saying, you can tell Donald Trump is going to be a law and order president from his views about the Central Park 5 case. Now, if you look at that, that's a very puzzling comment, because the Central Park 5, the 5 teenagers arrested for the horrific rape of a jogger in Central Park, were completely innocent. And yet Donald Trump, throughout the 2016 campaign, said they were guilty. So what's meant by law and order there? What's meant by law and order is that young black men are by their nature criminals. So law and order campaign, so law and order doesn't mean law and order. Law and order means the out group are criminals. What kind of criminals are they? What kind of criminals are the out group? Rape. They're rapists. The genocide of the Rohingya, I believe that's what we should call it, started in 2012. Well, didn't start, but it's sort of 3 Rohingya men raped a Rakhine woman in 2012. They consigned the entire Rohingya population to 180-some villages. They all lost their jobs, of course, because they were relegated to villages. They were all declared rapists and criminals. And then people started saying, oh, look, they're lazy and they live off the state. They don't have jobs, because, of course, they lost their jobs because they were consigned to villages. And 5 years later, the slaughter began. So that's a chapter called Sexual Anxiety. Then the next chapter is called Sodom and Gomorrah, which is about, people talk all the time about how, there's a rural-urban divide. Wow, Trump support comes from rural areas. Well, it turns out that the kind of politics that fascist politics involves, so this is not as robust a generalization as other generalizations, but it's very widely the case that the hated in-group lives in the cities. So Jews in Europe lived in the cities. Chapter 2 of Mein Kampf is called My Time in Vienna. Chapter 1 is about his glorious small town. Then he goes to Vienna, and he says, I go to Vienna. And there are Jews, foreigners everywhere, and Jews, and more Jews. The city is the site of race mixing. The city is the site where different groups come together, where there are gays. And it turns out in my country, the expression inner city means place where black people live. So it's again and again, the city is represented as a den of iniquity in this politics. Remember Sarah Palin, where real Americans live? That's the first sort of marks we got of a very familiar European politics. And the final chapter in my book is called Arbeit macht frei, work shall make you free. That was emblazoned on the gates of Auschwitz. And why was it emblazoned on the gates of Auschwitz? Because Jews were said to be lazy. Jews were said to be lazy. Throughout the education textbooks in Nazi Germany, they would show pictures of soft hands and say, these are Jewish hands, they've never worked at all. And the idea was that Jews were lazy and lived off the state. They lived off the state, they lived off banking, which was a method to extract interest from hardworking Aryans, and just without any hard work of your own. So Jews were lazy, and they should be forced to work for free to purify them. So this idea that the outgroup should be forced to work for free is something you see very often in the construction of outgroups. The outgroup should be forced to work for free because it's good for them. The idea behind concentration camps would be good for them. The lazy Jews have lived off hard-working Germans long enough, and they should be forced to work for free. It will teach them a work ethic. So this construction, the idea that the outgroup, that we are glorious and our glory has been dimmed by feminism, by forced equality, by race mixing, by integration, by allowing others into our community and being forced to regard them as equals. Why are we better? Because of our glorious military achievements, because of our mighty civilizational accomplishments, because we are hardworking, because we are law-abiding, because they are criminal and they are lazy. This is the construction that we see that is the basis right now of politics in Brazil, of politics all over Europe, Hungary, Poland. There's a harsh patriarchal element which I've not delved as deeply into as I should, that connects to homophobia, because one of the orderings of hierarchy is men over women. That's why trans women are such a threat in fascist politics. No one ever talks about the threat of trans men. No one ever says, oh, they're turning our girls into boys. They say they're turning our boys into girls. That's because it's men over women. And the challenge would be a man choosing to be a woman, because that would be rejecting the natural hierarchy. So it's this hierarchical thinking of one group over other groups, one nation over other nation. Value is assigned not by the dignity of humans, but by membership in a group. And all of this is employed to undermine truth and replace it with power. And this is, sadly, I think Stephen Miller is right, that it's something in political. If you look at the history of political philosophy, it's been a long history of arguing. Not that fascism, as I've described it, is more natural than liberal democracy, but that power, because nationalism is relatively novel, but that power, that democracy is too hard for people, and they want to follow. They're like, freedom is too hard, and people are inclined to be too susceptible to be made afraid of each other and seek a strong leader to protect them. So concluding with a hopeful note, one thing that makes me happy to be a U.S. citizen is that we have a long history of this, and we have a long history of fighting back against it. In my propaganda course, it's a course in African American Studies and Philosophy, and I teach Ida B. Wells and W.E.B. Du Bois, who were fighting against this for generations. So we have this history here. We have a history of being a country that does come together in the face of dehumanization of our fellow human beings and responding, and we can build and draw on that history in the years to come. Thank you.
Thank you, Jason.
Professor, thank you for your insight into fascism. My concern is that the term fascism is being diminished today by accusing anyone that you might have a disagreement with of calling them a fascist. And that is, again, minimizing the real seriousness of fascism. Another point I'd like to make is that I'm not so fearful of fascism as I am the stupidity and the ignorance of the American public. When the number of people who vote today, the number of people who watch the icons of the Fox News, the CNNs, the MSNBCs, they operate in virtually an echo chamber of their own belief system. And instead of reaching out beyond the scope of this media manipulation of the truth, then they are basically wallowing in ignorance. And that is a bigger fear that I have than fascism. Can you comment on that?
Yeah, excellent. Both excellent points. Let me take the second one first. I would say the second one is connected to fascism because ignorance makes us much more susceptible to replacing truth by power. We're warned again and again by, it's very important to turn back to the literature of Arendt and Adorno and Victor Klemperer, people who lived through transitions of liberal democracies to fascism. And what they warn us again and again is the replacement of information by spectacle. And that's what you're describing, that's what you see in MSNBC, that's what you see in Fox News. You see the desire, I mean, why is it that all the networks are showing Mr. Trump, President Trump's speech tonight, and they didn't show Obama's 2014 speech on immigration? They didn't show Obama's 2014 speech on immigration because no one would have watched it. They're showing Trump's speech because the networks are making more money than they ever have. The networks are raking in the dollars. And so it's a mutual thing that's happening now. Oh, what astonishing, terrible thing is he going to say now? And so, you know, it's truth and a shared common reality, as I was saying, that's important for liberal democracy. So your second point is about the undermining of that shared reality. And that is very dangerous, and replacing with spectacle. Now what I do in my work that's different from what, say, Hannah Arendt does in Origins of Totalitarianism, is Hannah Arendt focuses on totalitarianism. She's focusing on both communism and fascism together. Both of these are totalitarian systems that are anti-freedom and undermine liberal democracy. My work only concerns fascism, because I think if you theorize the two together, I don't think communism is a worry in the United States. I think communism is a worry in Cuba, it's a worry, but it's not a worry here. We're sort of conditioned, there's never been any kind of movement that could progress in that direction. But there's a very particular structure that's threatening a bunch of countries now. And it's the one I've described, based on ultranationalism, based on this social Darwinism of nations. And so it's a very particular structure. And I want to emphasize, so I think like when people are like, oh, you're being a fascist, meaning they often mean you're being authoritarian, you're being totalitarian, you're shutting down freedom. But there's multiple ways to shut down freedom. I mean, communism does what fascism does, but with classes instead of races. So communism says you can kill the rich rather than you can kill the black people, you know, or the Jews. And fascism replaces that with ethnicity, with religion. So it's a very particular thing. And I've been trying to describe its very particular structure. When you find the outgroup called lazy and criminal, when you find a harshly patriarchal structure, when you find, you know, race, or what Hitler in Mein Kampf calls the nation, being elevated over the state, that's a very particular structure. And so I'm looking, and I think that we need to be attentive to the fact that there are very few people who, it's a spectrum concept. So you can be more or less fascist, just like you can be more or less communist. Like Bernie Sanders is for universal health care, and so was Fidel Castro. But Bernie Sanders is not Fidel Castro. Similarly, like, you know, there are conservatives who are who are patriarchal and for the traditional family and anti-gay, but, you know, they're not social Darwinists, and so they're not fascists. So it's a very particular structure that I describe in my book.
Professor, are you ready for a challenging question?
Shoot.
Could you give a one-sentence definition of fascism?
Only if you allow me the use of the word "and" 10 times.
Of course.
Well, my book, so one thing I want to say is my book is about fascist politics. It's not about fascist government. So people are always saying to me, but we don't, you know, you're saying that Donald Trump is a fascist, but we're not living under a fascism. He's not imprisoning his opponents. My book isn't about fascist government, because I think there's too much diversity among governments that were taken over by people using this kind of politics. My book is about a particular way of running for office, a particular way of representing yourself, a particular rhetoric, and a particular ideology. And you can come to power and, for all I know, hand out candies to everyone. once you use that. But it's we were talking about this over dinner. It's it's a kind of way to grab power. Say, dominant group, you're the best, but your power is waning. You're not getting the respect you deserve, because the lazy criminals are taking over. It's that politics, and that's what I call fascist. And there's 10 parts to that characterization. But if I were to give a short shrift, it would be fascism. Fascism is an ideology based on power, loyalty, and fear of the other, where the other is conceived of in racial or ethnic terms.
You get an A+. All right. A question here as to the difference between our government and other governments that have devolved into fascism. The question is, isn't the fact that we have an independent judiciary and an independent press one of the defining features, and how fragile might these institutions be?
Excellent. So again, my work is about fascist propaganda and ideology. It's not about fascist government. But that said, what we're finding all across the world is we're finding, including in the United States, is we're finding our democratic institutions being set under attack. Hannah Arendt in The Origins of Totalitarianism. So remember, my one-sentence definition of fascism that we'll go through the rest of the question session with is going to be power, loyalty, and fear of the other, where the other is defined in ethnic terms. So if you think of a democratic institution like a judiciary or the press is based on truth. It's based on having a mission and accurately and competently following that mission. Arendt says what you see, the signs of a democracy dissolving, are when the democratic institutions, the competent people, get replaced by incompetent loyalists. So she says competence, accuracy, following reality is the worst enemy of the totalitarian. Here she's speaking of both communism and fascism. So when you find democratic institutions being undermined by loyalty replacing competence and truth, that's when you find the movement towards actual fascism, or totalitarianism, more generally. Because again, truth, accuracy, reality, these are the core of democracy.
Thank you. Your book explains how fascist tactics operate. It is a disturbing picture. In the epilogue, you stress that we must not allow the outrageous speech and tactics of Trump and his followers to become normalized. You recommend that we label their speech and acts fascist. My concern is that this may simply lead to a more polarized and divisive relationships between and prevent building bridges with those on the right who seem blind to the dangers we face. What other strategies might be employed to combat those who are attacking the institutions of American democracy?
Excellent. So, all right, so there's an empirical question here. There's an empirical question that says that people on the right are much more sensitive than people on the left. That's the empirical claim. That people on the right are, what is the current term, snowflakes, and people on the left are not. Because no one is going to make me a communist by calling me a communist. That's not going to happen. People have called me communist, it doesn't make me a communist. So, but apparently, if you mislabel someone on the right a fascist, it turns them into a fascist. So I don't know, that's an empirical question. People on the right are weird, according to this hypothesis. And people on the left, like me, were like, no, our response to being called a communist is like, no, I'm not a communist. But maybe people on the right are weird like that. I'm skeptical, but that said, I think even if people on the right are weird like that, and this addresses your point as well, it's much more dangerous not to call something what it is. Much more dangerous. I spend my days reading actual card-carrying Nazis, white nationalists. We are hearing their vocabulary on a regular basis from the Oval Office. So, I don't know what to say when all the far right, when Steve Bannon tells people to read Camp of the Saints, This is not some innocent book. You know, when we hear globalist and nationalist being just like regularized, now of course there's hint, hint, wink, wink. Bannon is like, oh, we mean economic nationalism. You know, economic does not modify nationalist. Those are two words that don't go together.
We have a question over there.
Hello. I'm trying to think of positive alternatives. So why do you think Alexandra Ocasio-Cortez is doing so well? I mean, my own, the little I know of it, is she was prepped and she has around her a staff of ex-Bernie Sanders people, and she's really fast. She's
incredibly smart.
So, I mean,
have you followed her on Twitter? Don't mess with her.
I don't do that, but you can see that there's this counterpunching and stuff like that. So I'm wondering whether that's an appropriate antidote.
Then that's appropriate what?
Antidote toward.
Oh, yeah, yeah.
Because she makes fun of people.
She talks
about Trump. Yeah. She says, well, you know, he's just a guy from Queens. He really doesn't understand anything.
Yeah. No, I mean, I think, yeah. I mean, everything you say I agree with. I think that she's somebody, I mean, this is on a different topic. This is on the hope topic. And I have to, like, you know, I have to, like, somehow constrain my sense of, I tweeted the other day that, like, AOC has entirely changed my interview style, because I'm now like, oh yeah, fascism is arising everywhere in the world, but Alexandra Ocasio-Cortez, and you know, she's just a freshman congressperson. But yeah, she's a very gifted politician. You know, she's a very gifted politician who uses humor and hardscrabble, cool background, and you know, and is irreverent and quick as heck. You know, she's just a really good politician. And politics is, I mean, I said over dinner to much horror that I admire Trump's political acumen. Trump is a very good strategist of the kind of a certain kind of politics. He's very good at that. You know, when you're, unsurprisingly, because he's a television person and an entertainer, and this kind of politics involves replacing fact by spectacle. And Ocasio-Cortez is just incredibly smart, gifted politician. So yeah, I mean, because when civic discourse gets broken down, when civil discourse gets broken down, when you can call people the things people are being called nowadays, you need humor. So, you know, you need to be able to fight it with sarcasm. And also, the way to cut down this kind of politics, because it's a kind of sneering macho politics, is by making fun of it. Because when you make fun of it, that's what a lot of people who follow authoritarians say. They say, don't, you know, a lot like Masha Gessen, a bunch of people, they're like, don't treat these people as scary. Because when you treat them as scary, you're giving them what they want. That's why Woodward's book is called Fear, right? You know, they survive off you being scared of them. So I think that these are reasons why she's clearly unafraid, and so these are.
We have a question there?
Yeah, you had, first place, you have a chapter you didn't mention on anti-intellectuals.
Oh, I skipped anti-intellectuals.
Skip that, it's all right. But yeah. let me just say this if I can. When I started, I read Trump's book back in the 80s. I saw what he was. He says who he is. When Tony Schwartz finally was interviewed and he spoke up, and he said that he had Hitler's materials by his bedside. He lived with him for 18 months. I already saw, I said, when I started hearing Hillary liar, Hillary liar, Hillary liar, followed by Fox 9 times a day. They did this on purpose. Elections rigged, elections rigged, elections rigged. This is what Goebbels said to do in propaganda. I saw that a long, long time ago. And I came up with ridicule stuff before Donald Trump was even nominated. And I didn't know what to do, like DDT, dump Donald Trump. You know what DDT is, right? Or DTs. I had all these crazy things. And I wanted to ridicule because that's that he's appealing to a certain group of people at a certain level that we've not used to. And we're trying to do it the ethical, nice way. Excuse me, us liberals who now have to defend being a liberal, which makes me sick to my stomach. They know how to get at us, and we don't know how to fight back in their terms. And so he beats us every single time.
So one way to fight back is call them fascists.
Excuse me?
What's that?
One way to fight back is call people fascists when they use certain. So.
I have a question. Sorry.
But there was one thing I was going to say. Yeah, one point that my colleague, Timothy Snyder, emphasizes is the rhythmic chanting, the lock her up, build the wall. That chanting, and as I say in my book, quote Bannon saying, we won on lock her up, build the wall. You get people locked into those chants, then, they're not thinking.
What's your sense of the anti-fascist movement that fights the fascists in the streets?
That's a great question. Lots of great questions, points. In Germany, I don't think, so my view of our situation, so my book's being translated in 8 languages, and I think other countries face more threats, and I think Mr. Trump employs fascist tactics, but I think our democratic institutions are strong, and I don't think he either doesn't have an interest in becoming like a genuine authoritarian or can't become a genuine authoritarian. So I'm not actually that frightened. I'm more frightened about our democratic ethos. I'm more frightened that our sense of reality, our sense of shared reality, our sense of equal respect and civility towards each other is being broken down than I am that Donald Trump is going to become a dictator. I'm not that frightened of that. So I think that there isn't as much need. We are seeing, and those of us who follow this know this, we're seeing a very clear rise in white nationalism. But the rise we're seeing is in a kind of respectable white nationalism. We have, from the very top, a lot of winks. We have Fox News. I think Tucker Carlson is very popular among extreme white nationalists. But the sort of battles on the street between street thugs and Antifa, I wouldn't call it a sideshow because it's strategically very important to have the people the fascists on the street, because the people wearing ties and suits and in political parties can say, we're not fascists, look at the people on the street, they're the fascists. So that's always been the case. You need the people on the street. This is why Daniel Fleeberg in The Real Right Returns says, never resort to violence. Always condemn those, because the goal is respectability. So stuff is happening on the streets, and the people, the respectable political parties who are pushing fascist agendas need the people on the streets to distance themselves, but it is a little bit of a sideshow.
Thank you. Claire?
I'm just wondering how our Democratic Party, for those of us who are registered Democrats, can change some of its tactics, not to become lost in their own political votes and things like that. Where can we go?
So where, sorry, I just acoustically didn't hear.
In other words, where can the Democratic Party lead people so that we vote for Democrats and vote for positive changes in the system when it's very hard? People don't know the truth, as you were saying before.
Yeah. Well, I think, that's a great question. And especially, I think, one thing I haven't talked about is so here's one thing. I think it's really important for people to see that the people who are giving us the nationalism and giving us the hyper-nationalism and the macho politics are not promoting policies that are helping, the people they're supposedly speaking to. And it's important for investigative journalists to show the corruption. That's why the investigative journalists that gets assassinated in Russia are always the ones who are showing corruption, because that's a danger. Because, so I think if people can see, okay, for instance, Mr. Trump, maybe he cares most of all about making a lot of money for himself. And maybe he's using you. You know, and maybe he's really corrupt after all. Like, that kind of investigative journalism is really important, and will, I think, will hopefully lead, certainly if you follow which journalists get killed by authoritarians, they tend to be the journalists who are showing that the authoritarian leader is actually in it for the money.
One last question. We seem to get this question a lot with these events. Is it time to move to Canada? Do you know real estate agents in Canada, by the way?
Well, I think, first of all, the governor of Ontario is the brother of the former mayor of Toronto, and he's as bad as anything you could. There's a lot of white nationalism in Canada, and there are no black Americans. There are very few black Americans, and they're going to protect us somehow, I feel. So,
well, let's give Professor Jason Stanley a great round of applause. Thank you very much. Thank you.